Good afternoon YouTube, I'm Chucky2009 and today I'm going to be teaching y'all how to stick weld. Yeah, I've never really put together any videos quite like this, but basically what you're watching right now is my 6-part series, which is intended to take someone with little to no practical stick welding experience, not really being familiar with any of the equipment or the process, through some basic practice drills, let's say. So this is going to be something that is going to require a lot of practice on your part, but I'm going to hopefully give you all the information and the background you need to get going. And here in part 1, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be having a look at the welder we're going to be using. We're going to be talking a little bit about settings, some of the hand tools and other things we'll be using, and then we're going to work on how to strike an arc, how to maintain an arc, keep it from going out, and even run a few beads. So if you want to hang around for that, I highly encourage it. Otherwise, if you already know this stuff, feel free to skip ahead to part 2, which is going to be flat and horizontal position, lap in, fillet welds. Alright, so for those of y'all that are staying behind with me, let's have a look at what exactly we're going to be working with. We've got some scrap metal, which we'll be using to run what's referred to as a pad of beads. We've got more scrap metal that we'll be using for arc starting practice. And tonight we're going to be welding with some 1/8 inch Hobart 6013s. These electrodes, while they might not have the highest strength or the best mechanical properties of the common stick electrodes, they're excellent on thin material, and the reason we're using them tonight, they're very easy to get an arc going with and establish the arc. So we got that, and then we've got our stick electrode holder, we got our ground clamp clamped to our table, and some basic hand tools. You're going to need a slag chip and hammer, of course. Something looks kind of like this. This is an S-Wing brand hammer that I've been very pleased with. You're going to need a wire brush. We got one of those, and some basic safety equipment. And the primary thing you need for stick welding, a stick welder. Actually, this is a TIG welder, as you can see, but it also stick welds, and that's what we're going to be using it for tonight. So let's go ahead and get this set up. Now, the first thing you're going to want to do if you just bought a welder off of Craigslist or whatever, is you're going to want to check the leads and make sure they're not cracked. There's no exposed copper sticking through, nothing like that. And make sure you got good tight connection. And then let's go ahead and fire up the welder. If you're using a multi-process machine, you want to make sure it's set to stick mode, which ours is, of course. And for the 1/8 inch 6013 electrodes, I'm going to set this thing to about somewhere between 110 and 120 amps. I'll just stick it right there in the middle. And we will put it on DC, electrode negative. Since this is an AC-DC machine, if you only have an AC welder, well, that's another good thing about 6013. It's AC friendly. So, but I have both, so I'll be using DC. Alright, let's keep moving. Now I'll just put my gear on here, and the very first thing we're going to be doing tonight is working on striking an arc and maintaining the arc, keeping it from going out. And basically, the way we're going to do this is, actually I'm going to go turn off this welder that you just watched me turn on. This way, I don't blind myself. Alright, pretty much the way you start an arc is take your full stick electrode here. And you, of course, insert it into your electrode holder. And then what you do is you get your scrap metal ready. Now this, as you can see, is what looks to be 1/4 inch thick. And by looking at this side, it looks kind of dull and gray. This is called mill scale. This, where I've been grinding on it here, that's perfectly clean steel. This is called mill scale. That's a little bit of really basic terminology that you're going to need to know. And for stick welding, you don't really have to worry about that, but for other processes, you will. Alright, so with your welder turned off, the first thing you're going to want to do is practice this. I'll just take the tip of the stick electrode here, and you brush it against a piece of material. Now, everybody's going to tell you it's like striking a match, and that's because, quite frankly, it is. It's like striking a 14-inch long metallic match. And just practice this a little bit. You dip down towards the plate, contact the plate, and then up, and hopefully your arc will be going, at which point you go back down towards the plate and watch your puddle form, and then you drag your puddle along, and you're welding. So, yeah, definitely just practice this until you get the hang of it. And another thing to practice is releasing your stick electrode, because you're probably going to stick this thing a number of times before you get it right. It's no big deal. It happens to everybody. Happened to me. Happened to most people. Pretty much all you do is you give it a twist, and the stick electrode just pops out. Hard to do with the camera zoomed in here. But if you have a clamp style electrode holder, just familiarize yourself with releasing the electrode. Maybe try it with your eyes closed to simulate, you know, having your hood down and there's nothing to watch. But either way, be ready to release the electrode, and once we actually crank up the welder and practice this, if it sticks, just pop it loose and break it off and try it again. Now, don't worry, I have like 5 certifications in this. Alright, now that time I obviously didn't really have to break the electrode loose, but sometimes you can get away with just giving it a nice twist. That's also something that you're going to have to become familiar with. Alright, let's try that again. Alright, and once you become confident in your abilities to strike an arc and hold it and break it, then you'll probably have a whole bunch of little welds like what we see here. Now, one thing I will say is if you have one ginormous blob, then you're going like way too slow. And alternatively, if you just have streaks like this is a little bit more than an arc strike, then you're going too fast. And actually, the first few times I stick welded, this is exactly what I did. But for the rest of them, we're just going to go ahead and clean these up a little bit. I'm going to take my slag chipping hammer, and with 60-13 they should come clean pretty easily. Just a few little taps is all it takes. One thing I will say that a lot of people do, and I even used to do, is just absolutely beat the crap out of the piece of steel with this hammer, which isn't really how it works. You know, if it's not coming off, try holding it down with your wire brush, doing sort of a little scraping action like that. But anyway, once all the slag has been removed, we'll just take a wire brush that I think I left out in the rain, and de-rustify the brush and de-slagify the welds. Alright, so once you've done this drill a few times and you're familiar with it, as mentioned, then you're going to want to move on to the next thing that we're going to be talking about. Alright, YouTube, so I've gone ahead and turned off the welder and put a fresh stick electrode in my stick electrode holder, and that's because the next thing we're going to be doing is referred to as the pad of beads. And this is, as the name implies, a piece of steel covered in, wait for it, a pad of weld beads. Alright, this is the next step between what the heck is a stick welder and actually being able to weld out some flat and horizontal position basic welds. By now, you know, in the last exercise you figured out how to strike an arc and keep it from going out, and now you're going to use those awesome abilities to put down some weld metal and actually have something to show for it here. So what you're going to need for this is obviously a piece of steel. You want it to be relatively clean, no rust, no paint, no powder coat, no excessive oil. Mill scale's okay, but nothing more. And you're going to want it to be at least 3/16 of an inch thick, I would say. You don't really want to go thinner because it's going to get really hot. You'll probably melt through it or at least twist it into a pretzel or something. And you can realistically go about as thick as you want. This is about 4x4, I think. Maybe it's 5x5. I'm pretty sure it's 5x5. I think these are like 2.5 wide, and I've got 2 of them here. And I didn't really have anything that was the perfect size, so I just tacked together a couple pieces of flat stock. And the way we're going to do this is to simply start at one side and weld our way across until this entire thing is covered in weld beads. And a couple things I want to point out before we do this is the first thing you're going to want to notice, and this will help you in any and all welding you do, is that you're going to want to brace yourself somehow. I have my elbow on the table, I'm holding the electrode holder such as this, and this is probably one of the secrets to welding that nobody's probably going to tell you and you're probably going to have to figure out by yourself. If I'm back here just holding it with one hand, I'm going to be all shaky and everything. So if you want to make good looking welds, you're going to want to be consistent, and in order to do that, you're probably going to want to brace yourself. But the main thing you're going to want to know is a little something about travel angle and rod angle. Now in the last exercise, it doesn't really matter if you're pointing the electrode like this or off to the side or whatever, because all you're trying to do is start an arc and keep it from going out for a few seconds. But when you're actually depositing metal and you're really welding stuff, you're going to have to pay attention to that. Now, because of the slag coating over a molten weld puddle, you can't really push with stick because that gets sucked into your weld puddle and screws it up. You get massive porosity and holes in your weld. So you're obviously going to want to pull the electrode along, and basically you're going to want to hold the electrode about like such, about as you see it here. Some people say 10 to 20 degrees as I think pretty much the commonly accepted, whatever you want to call it, but about like this. I know that's really helpful, but I'm going to be pulling the electrode towards me, and I'm going to be keeping it, because we're working on a flat plate here, I'm going to be keeping it 90 degrees this way and just pull towards me a little bit this way so that the slag goes to the back of the puddle. Again, if I'm looking at the way I'm traveling, which is this way, it's 90 degrees straight up and down, and then this way it's just pulled towards me a little bit. Alright, let's go ahead and fire up the welder and then start depositing our pad of beads. We're just going to put one bead down, and then we'll talk about overlap and a few other things. Actually, I'll put a few beads down so I can show you different types of overlap. So, alright, let's crank up the welder and get to it. Manual wire brushes are for noobs. Alright, so there's actually nothing wrong with using a manual brush, but I figured I'd go ahead and do this. It would be real clean, and hopefully y'all can see every little detail. But basically, this is kind of what we're aiming for here. I mean, the beads are pretty much consistent. They look about the same. And primarily in terms of overlap, they're smooth. Like, especially this area right in here. I'll make sure that's the only one I film. I mean, yeah, just looking at this, you want the top of this bead to run into the top of the next bead here. And the way you achieve that is by looking at this little model I've done. As you can see, this is way too much overlap. One bead's pretty much right on top of the other, and then we went to not nearly enough overlap, and there's this nice valley right here. As you can see here, there's no valley. It's just pretty nice and smooth and consistent. And while we're at it, let's talk about travel speed. This is not nearly enough travel speed. This is going way too slow. As you can see, this bead is probably about a ½ an inch wide. I mean, I guess it's not going that slow, but it's still a little bit on the slow side. And if your welds are looking big and gloppy and ginormous, you might want to go a little bit faster. And alternatively, if they're looking like this, then that's a sign of going way too fast. But if you're trying everything you can and your welds still aren't looking exactly how you'd like them to look, and you've got some time on your hands, then I recommend watching a video I did last summer, or actually I think it was summer before, on how not to stick weld. It goes in depth with the rod angle, travel speed, arc length, things like that. And so, you know, if you have way too much arc length, you'll know what to look for and how to fix it. And if you're new to this and you're going through this little program I'm putting together here, that might be of great assistance to you. Otherwise, if the welds are looking kind of half decent, then congratulations, you're ahead of many, I'm sure, and you're just going to want to go ahead and sit down and finish out this pad of beads and maybe run another one just for the heck of it. And furthermore, throughout your at-home welding education by yours truly here, anytime you want to experiment with a different electrode, or when you get to 6010, 6011, if you want to try out the whip and pause, anytime you want to try something new, it's not a bad idea to go ahead and run a pad of beads first. Doesn't really take a lot of steel, doesn't take that many electrodes, and it's an excuse to just weld and put down bead after bead and not worry about anything else and just get a feel for what it is you're doing. Another thing I'll point out is that this is getting pretty hot already, I'm sure. Yeah, I can feel the heat just radiating off of it. And so you might want to, every 4, 5, 6 beads, or 3, or just depending on the type of steel you're working with, how thick it is, you might want to dump this in some water just to cool it off Side note, it's not really a good idea to do that on an actual project, but on a pad of beads like this, just on some scrap metal, it's not going to hurt anything, it'll still weld the same. Side note, if you're going to be doing any quantity of stick welding, as much as I love the process, it's a little bit smoky, so you're going to want some ventilation, and you're going to want to keep your head out of the fumes, just like I never do. Alright. Now we're into part 2. We're going to be working on some horizontal and flat position fillet welds and lap joints. So let's have a look what we got set up. We've got a few 1/8 inch 6013 electrodes and a couple of welding joints set up. Now back when I first got into welding, this is what I considered to be a flat position fillet weld. You know, you got a fillet joint just sitting on a table flat like this, but in actuality a flat position fillet weld is like this. That is actually horizontal, and so that's just one thing I thought I'd throw in. This could be considered a fillet weld. I think it's more like 4 inside corner joints, but regardless, if you are welding a flat position fillet weld, pretty much all you have to do is drag your electrode right down the center of the joint, and it almost welds itself, so to speak. A horizontal position fillet weld is about the same thing, just with a slightly different angle, because you know you got some gravity to account for here. But now that we have that covered, let's talk about welding out a horizontal position fillet weld. Alright, here's something that vaguely resembles the fillet weld we're looking at. Imagine you're looking at it, you know, from the edge here, and if we're depositing this weld right there, then imagine this as being one side of a 90-degree angle and this being another, because, well, that's pretty much all a fillet weld is. And the center would be here. So what I like to do is imagine where the center is, then come down just a little bit. And the reason why you go down a little is because gravity is going to want to pull the weld bead this way, thus you need to kind of shove it up that way a little bit, which you can do by, instead of going in at a perfect 45, coming down just a little bit. Not that much, just about that much. So that's how you position your electrode in terms of up and down. How about back and forth, you ask? Well, that's going to depend a little bit on the electrode that you're going to be using. Now, later on in this video, I'm going to get y'all going on welding with some 7018, but assuming you're welding with 6013, which has a slag that's a little bit harder to control, I'll say, I'm going to run a little bit more of a drag angle. I'm probably going to be more like this, whereas with 7018 or 6010, or with an electrode that has a little bit of an easier to control, let's say slag, molten slag puddle, I'd probably be more in this general area. But so to paraphrase this before we actually start welding it out, you're going to want to look at the ends of your fillet weld. Imagine it as the 90-degree angle that makes up the fillet weld. Go to the middle and go down just a little bit to account for gravity, and give yourself probably about that much of a drag angle, assuming you're working with, well, 6013. So I guess we're about ready to actually start welding this out. Now what happens if you get the drag angle wrong, you ask? Well, if you're not using enough of a drag angle, then your molten slag puddle is going to flow to the front of your molten weld puddle and actually possibly get sucked into the puddle, and then it stays here and you get big ugly slag holes. But I think I touched on this a little bit in part 1 and also in the stick weld troubleshooting video, so I'm not really going to hit on it that much. All I can really say before we begin is this is going to have a little bit of a learning curve to it, and if after you watch this video maybe you want to try a flat position fillet weld before you do the horizontal, there's no shame in that. If you think that'll help you, it might be worthwhile. But with that being said, let's crank up the welder and get her done. Alright YouTube, so I'm going to brace myself to remain as steady as possible and thus help to turn out a moderately better looking weld bead. And then I'm going to position the electrode just like we talked about, imagining the 90-degree angle that makes up the fillet weld. I'm going to split that in half, go down a little bit, and add drag angle. I think we're ready to do it. Come on. let's see how we did. Okay, so as you can see on this bottom plate, we do have a little bit more spatter than I'd like to see, but again, we are kind of running this electrode up at its upper limit, so maybe that's a little bit inevitable, but regardless, let's chip away this slag and see how we did. As mentioned, you shouldn't really have to beat on it. So that one little spot there, and now I'll wire brush it. And there it is. So most of that spatter came up no problem, and as you can see, the weld bead is equally distributed between the top and the bottom plate. We don't seem to have any undercut, and there's no ginormous slag holes. I find that slag holes predominantly happen in the first inch or so weld, at least when I get them, which thankfully is pretty rare, but if that's something you're struggling with, like I used to struggle with quite a bit actually, I just recommend trying a slightly different drag angle, trying more drag angle. But yeah, horizontal position fillet weld with 6013, there you go. Alright, and the primary thing I'd like for y'all to take out of this lesson is how to do a horizontal position fillet weld, but if what you just saw looks a little bit intimidating, let's say, I mean, probably all you've done thus far is flat position work on a piece of plate. You're only worried about one piece of material, and I realize that trying something A in a different position and B with two pieces of material to keep track of, that might be a little bit much. So like I said, if you want to try this in the flat position before you jump to the horizontal, there's really no shame in that, and since I still have the other side of this to weld out, I might as well just go ahead and tack this up in the flat position and give you a brief rundown and how to do that. Now looking at the sides of this joint here, basically you're pretty much going to want to split the difference of the angle that makes up our flat position fillet weld. And because the sides are at 45-degree angles instead of 90s, you're going to want to have the electrode pretty much straight up and down this ways, and the drag angle is going to be about the same, maybe a tad less just because we're in the flat position now, but if it's any less, it's not going to be much. Like I said, pretty much the same. So let's put this electrode in the electrode holder and get to it. Looks about the same, just rotated to a 45. No wait, it's not a 45, rotated 45 degrees, yeah, there we go. But speaking of electrodes, let's try another one. We are going to switch to running 1/8 inch Hobart 7018. Why? Because this is an accelerated learning program, and I have to fit the 7018 in here somewhere. 6013, for all the good things about it, it's primarily only used on thinner material because it lacks the penetration and the mechanical properties of certain other electrodes, such as 7018. A little more about 7018: for every pound of everything else I've ever stick welded with, I've probably burned 10 to 20 pounds of 7018. This is what's very commonly used in pipe welding. It's commonly used in fabrication work. It's probably the most commonly used stick electrode out there, and once you get the hang of welding with 6013, it's not really that big of a jump over to 7018. The main differences are how it's going to sound, how the flux is going to look, and a little bit about the settings on the welder. 7018 does not work well on electrode negative, as you'll learn when someone wants to be a rectal opening and switches your welder when you're at lunch or whatever. But anyway, I'll just set this to electrode positive and bump up the amps to about 125, yeah, about 125 amps for what we're working on here. Now if you want to use another pad of beads, if you want to run another layer over the pad of beads that you made in the last part of this program, or perhaps you want to try some simpler flat position fillet welds, then go for it. I recommend doing a little something to get the hang of welding with 7018. But like I said, once you're comfortable with 6013, there's really not that big of a jump to it. But anyway, let's continue welding out our horizontal fillet assembly of awesomeness here with the 1/8 inch 7018. And that's a horizontal fillet weld with 7018. Alright, so there's a few minor differences. There's the way it sounds and the way that the puddle looks. I actually strongly prefer running 7018 to pretty much any other electrode, especially 6013. I feel like you can see the puddle better. Slag entrapment isn't really nearly as big of a problem as it is with some other electrodes. And there's very little spatter. It just, you know, there's a little bit of a learning curve with 7018, but once you get over it, then I find it's honestly a joy to weld with. You know, with the single pass fillet welds with 7018, the same rules apply as doing them with 6013. You know, if your rod angle's off one way, you're going to have this problem. If it's off the other way, you're going to have that problem. And alternatively, if you're still having issues with single pass fillet welds, then I would refer to the stick weld troubleshooting video that I referenced in the previous video. If I remember, I'll put another link in the description. But once you have the feel for single pass fillet welds, let's try some multi-pass fillet welds. Now, when would you use a multi-pass fillet weld? Pretty much anytime you don't think that a single pass fillet weld would do the job, or you need some added strength. So what's different about a multi-pass fillet weld when you're running it? Quite frankly, not a whole heck of a lot. You're just going to use the two skills that you've mastered so far, such as overlapping beads from the pad of beads drill that you did earlier, and single pass fillet welds. And aside from that, there's really not a whole lot more to learn here. This really isn't very steep of a learning curve, I'll put it that way. Alright, so we have this TIG weld that I'll be using to demonstrate for stick purposes, don't ask why. And once you have your first pass in, this is something you can use those you know, single pass welds you've run thus far with to practice on. You're going to want to go ahead and apply the second pass. And basically, as opposed to going in with a rod angle such as this, you're going to pick up your electrode, because we're not aiming for this top plate, we're just aiming for down here and what's right next to down here. You don't have to try to tie into this piece or anything. What you're going to want to do is simply position your electrode like such. We're not straight up and down, but we're relatively close. We're about there. And the drag angle is going to be the same throughout pretty much this entire course. But you're going to want to position your electrode as such and try to cover up this bead. Again, you're going to want about 2/3 overlap, pretty much the same exact thing you had in the pad of beads demonstration. And you're just going to run your second bead down yonder ways. I rotated where I was welding, so hopefully we can get some slag removal action for y'all. But alright, one thing I'll throw in, since 7018 tends to be an easy to deslagify electrode, is instead of beating on this at all, I'm actually just going to run my hammer back and forth along the top, and then if needed the bottom toe line, and try to remove stuff that way. It doesn't really leave the little peg marks on your workpiece. And if there's a little bit left over, you can tap on it some, but case in point, there's really no need to beat the crap out of whatever it is you're welding on. As you can see, if we zoom in, let's see, is this electrode cool? Yeah, it makes a good pointer. This is, of course, our second pass, and it mostly covers up the third pass. If anything, maybe a little bit more overlap would have been acceptable here, but not a whole lot more. You're going to want to cover up most of the first pass, but you're still going to want to leave just a tiny little bit exposed. And then what we're going to do is, instead of coming in like this, we're going to drop our angle down some and still use about the same drag angle, about like such, to deposit our third and final pass. my weld. I'm literally half an inch from finishing that. By the way, you guys shouldn't make fun of me because I guarantee that's about to start happening to you. Behold, the 3-pass fillet weld. Now, if you'll notice, it lays in here nice and flat. You know, if I run the electrode over, you can feel where the second and third beads meet, but it's not like there's a massive ridge there or anything. It's just, it's nice and smooth. There's as much weld up here as there is down there. And if you look, there's no undercut or horrible discontinuities or anything. So, behold, triple pass fillet weld. Alright, so, you might be asking yourself, how many passes can I put down into a weld joint? A lot. Pretty much as many as the sides of the joint can physically contain. The biggest weld I think I ever put down was something insane. I want to say it was like 148 passes or 160 something passes. I don't really remember, but it was when I was torture testing a welder, and it was like hours of non-stop welding. But where I'm going with this is to point out that the fundamentals are exactly the same. If you're putting in 3 passes or 6 passes or 12 passes or whatever, as long as you understand the basics of bead placement, you pretty much got it made. So, alright, feel free to go practice that a little bit and refer back to this video. I feel like I'm going kind of fast through this stuff. I don't particularly like it, but at the same time, I mean, you know, it's an online video course. It's basic instruction. I can't really be there with you to work you through this bead after bead after bead. So pretty much all you're going to be able to do is to watch these videos and watch the troubleshooting videos I've done and hope for the best, unless you're lucky and have, you know, some, you know, hands-on formal instruction. But alright, enough about that. Let's do some lap joints. Behold, the lap joint. Alright, so this is what we're going to be trying to do here. And basically, as mentioned before, a lap joint is what happens when you take 2 pieces of material and you overlap one over the other. Basically, how do you weld a lap joint? Well, very similarly to how you weld a fillet weld. Basically, with a fillet weld, you want to come in at about this much of an angle, assuming it is a single pass fillet weld. About E much of an angle, as we discussed previously. There goes the fan on the precision TIG. But with a lap joint, I like to pick that up a little bit, not a lot. I mean, maybe 5-10 degrees tops, and the drag angle remains pretty much the same. But the main thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that when you're actually welding this, you know, you're going to want to strike an arc, form your puddle, and then wash your puddle into the top plate. And when you're actually moving along the top plate, you want to keep an eye on this upper edge here, and as soon as the edge melts, well, then you know you have all your ducks in a row and everything's going pretty well for you. Now, as you can see on this practice piece, it looks a little hot. We've got, I don't know, this undercut-ish thing going on in parts of it, so I'm actually going to turn down the welder, I don't know, 5 amps, let's say, to 120 amps, and then we'll take it from there. As I said, these are very similar to welding out fillet welds, and there's, well, quite frankly, not a whole lot of difference. Let's do it. By the time you've gotten to this point, you probably know a little bit about stick welding, and you've probably done a little bit of prior research before. That was the type of welding you decided to get into as your first venture, or second, or whatever, but you probably already know that stick welding is not really considered the ideal way to weld thin materials, and although you probably already know this, I'm just going to take a minute and hit on it a little bit more before we start this video. Well, I think that pretty much covers it. Stick welding is not the ideal choice for welding thin steel. If someone brought something to me that was made out of thin steel, say 1/8 inch or under, and I could stick weld it, or I could use any other welding process, any other common welding process, I would use any other common welding process. I'd rather MIG it. Well, actually, I'll tell you what I actually do here in the shop. If I have to weld on something that's 1/8 inch and down, I typically MIG weld it unless it has to be very structurally sound or extremely aesthetically appealing, in which case I TIG weld it, or if I just feel like TIG welding stuff. But as a general rule of thumb, I don't like to stick weld anything under 3/16 of an inch, and anything under 1/8 inch, you know, the difficulty increases exponentially as the thickness of material becomes smaller. So that's that. I would say the thinnest I feel comfortable stick welding, well, I guess I could go thinner. The thinnest I'd recommend stick welding is 14 gauge. Anything less than that, you know, exhaust tubing or auto body sheet metal, if you have to stick weld that, it's possible, don't get me wrong, but you're going to have a really bad time. But with that being said, in this series, we are going to talk about stick welding thicker material. In this episode, rather, we're going to talk about thicker material, but we're predominantly going to focus on thinner material. And the first rule that I'm going to give y'all is to avoid welding anything thinner than what the diameter of the electrode you're welding it with, especially with 6013. Well, pretty much just with 6013, more so than other electrodes. But if I'm welding with an 1/8 inch 6013, like what we've been running so far, I wouldn't want to use this on anything less than an 1/8 inch material thickness. But you're asking yourself, what if I have to weld something thinner than an 1/8 inch? Well, you simply use thinner 6013s. These are some 3/32 inch variety. I think they go all the way down to a 16th. But for anything less than an 1/8 inch, I recommend 3/32, and anything thinner than that, you know, a smaller electrode is only going to help you so much. It's not going to be a fun time once you get past like 14 gauge. But anyway, I guess the first thing we're going to do in this video is we're going to weld some 1/8 inch material with some 1/8 inch electrodes. Why? Because you're used to welding with 1/8 inch 6013s. That's what we've used most of the time in the series thus far, except for a little bit of 7018, as you know. But that being said, let's do it. These are some 1/8 inch coupons that consist of fillet and lap joints, and they're tacked up specifically for this purpose. Alright, actually they're left over from a how not to TIG weld video I did. You know, that's why the mill scale's been ground off. But anyway, this is what we're going to be working with tonight. Now, you're, like I said, probably a little bit familiar with welding on thicker material, and the main thing you're going to have to tell yourself when you jump from the thicker material to the thinner material is you're no longer as worried about penetration, and well, I guess that's pretty much just it. Well, if you're welding on 3/16, 1/4 inch, 3/8, 1/2 inch, whatever, penetration is going to be something that you're going to be thinking about. It's definitely something you want, and it's something you're going to work to achieve. When you're welding on thinner material, it's going to happen, and you have to predominantly worry about not getting too much of it, just because of the nature of what you're working with. With that being said, we're going to start off with the 1/8 inch electrodes that you're used to running, as mentioned, and we're going to try to keep the bead a little bit smaller. And we're going to turn down the welder a little bit. We've been working usually around the 115 amps. I'm going to turn this down to about 100, I'd say. And another thing for you to keep in mind is that when you weld something, you want to size the weld accordingly with the thickness of material that you're working with. That probably sounds self-explanatory, but if you're working on 1/4 inch material and you're fillet welding it, you're going to want a 1/4 inch size fillet weld. Likewise, with 1/8 inch material, you don't need as big of a weld, and running us lower amperage is going to help us to not burn through, not put too much heat into the material, because now we really have to work on that. I mean, it's a lot easier to warp 1/8 inch than it is 1/4 inch, and as mentioned, that just gets to be a bigger and bigger factor the smaller and smaller the material becomes. So let's run a bead on this. Now, in terms of rod angle and drag angle, well, nothing really changes. That's going to remain the same as it was when we were working on thicker material. That is the faster travel speed. Alright, now let's just deslagify this beautiful creation and see how we did. And there you have it, YouTube. On the fillet weld, same deal. The weld's pretty flat. It's evenly distributed between the top and the bottom plates. There's no slag holes, undercut, nothing big and horrendous like that. And the lap joint, pretty much the same deal. It's just a smaller version of the lap joint we did on 1/4 inch material an episode or two ago. Now if you notice, I'm not really talking much about 1/16 inch electrodes because I've tried them out in the past. There goes the fan on the welder. I've tried them out in the past and they're really small because they're almost kind of harder to control than other types of electrodes. I don't really have a lot of experience with them and you can't really find them where I live, so I'm going to say they're probably not all that common. And as a general rule of thumb, I'm going to say if it's so thin that you can't stick weld it with a 3/32 inch 6013, it's going to suck to stick weld it no matter what you use. So for anything under 14 gauge or 14 gauge, I'd use a 3/32 inch electrode. For 12 gauge, 11 gauge, 1/8 inch, what have you, I'd stick with an 1/8 inch electrode because, well, as you can see, that's what we've been using. It's been working out pretty well. And on 3/16 steel, I'd use the same 1/8 inch electrode. And for anything thicker than 3/16, I wouldn't use 6013. 6013 it's like any tool, it has its place, and its place is welding thinner material. It doesn't have the best penetration, it has barely any penetration, that's why it doesn't burn through as much as other electrodes. The mechanical properties could be a lot better, and it's really just suited for thinner material. And for that reason, on anything 1/4 inch and up, there's, in my opinion, better electrodes you could use. Now with that being said, 7018 is not designed for welding thin sheet metal. It's designed for intermediate and thick, let's say, sections of material. And for that reason, I don't like welding with it on anything thinner than 3/16. I mean, you can do 1/8 inch, don't get me wrong, I'm sure you could do thinner, but you know, in terms of comfort level and ease of use, I like to stick to 3/16 if possible. But for 3/16 steel, I'd recommend a 3/32 inch electrode, and for 1/4 inch and anything thinner, well, I'd recommend 1/8 inch or larger. We'll cover that later on in this video. Alright, now as I prepare to crack open this box of 3/32 inch 6013s, a couple things. First off, I have to do this in one take, because if I don't, I'm going to have to buy another box of electrodes to open on camera. Second off, let's talk about welding with the smaller diameter electrodes. The first thing you're going to have to keep in mind is that stick welding is a process where you set the amperage mainly for the electrode you're using, and you modify it a little bit depending on the thickness of material you're welding. With TIG or with some other processes, you set it more for what you're welding. With this, you set it for the electrode that's good for what you're welding. And with that being said, the biggest difference you're going to notice welding with smaller diameter stick electrodes is that they're going to run at a much lower amperage. How much lower of an amperage? I don't really know because I haven't run these in forever, but I'll find out and then I'll tell you guys. I find that for what we're doing out here, between 65 and 75 amps is probably a good place to start off. And now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and start running some beads. Now, mainly, this isn't really going to be that much harder, let's say, than welding with an 1/8 inch electrode. It's mainly just going to be different than what you're used to. You're going to have an electrode that looks a lot smaller than the difference between the two sizes actually is. I think it's only like a 32nd of an inch, but it's going to look completely different. The puddle's going to be a lot smaller, but it's going to flow the same, and the fundamentals we've practiced thus far, rod angle, drag angle, you know, that's going to be pretty much identical. Alright, let's clean it up and see how she looks. Now there's something I want to show you all here because some you're probably, well, there's a good chance you're going to have some issues with, and that is a slag hole at the beginning of your weld. Now electrodes like 6013 and 7014 and 7024 are particularly known for this just because of the type of a slag coating that they have. But as you can see, when I started this weld, you know, I didn't have an established puddle. I didn't have, you know, the flow of that puddle. I didn't have the arc really even established. And because of that, there wasn't really anything forcing the slag to the back of the puddle. And because of that, a little bit of it made it up to the front of the puddle and left me with this ginormous slag hole. Well, and I guess it's not that big, but still, that's not good. And I thought I would show this to y'all just to show you what can happen. And if you're having issues with this, all you have to do to fix it is, well, let's say this is the drag angle that you've been running through all your welds so far, and through to, you know, the middle of the weld and the end of the weld, it's working out great for you. But if you're having slag holes come up like this, what you need to do is something that will push the slag more so to the back of the puddle as the puddle's just beginning to form. And one way you can do that is to run more of a drag angle, strike the arc, form the puddle, and then as you weld, come back up to what you've been using thus far, or what you normally use. Now, a lot of the newbie welding projects I've seen and done, you know, on thinner material, one of the biggest issues they have is with warpage and heat management. I mean, you know, it's a lot harder to warp a piece of 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch plate than it is to warp something that's 14 gauge or an 1/8 inch or whatever. And if you're working with anything particularly thin, I mean, don't get me wrong, warpage can be an issue with steel that's literally inches thick, but the thinner it is, the more likely it is to warp. And if you're watching this video and you're interested in welding some thinner sheet metal on your own, maybe you'd want to read up a little bit on heat management. I actually made a video about it, well, that and warpage prevention, and maybe that could be of use to you if you've got some thinner metal welding projects in mind. And now I guess it's on to welding thicker steel. So if you're going to be welding thicker steel, you're going to need to get yourself some thicker steel to weld. Like this piece of, what is that, 1.5 inches? Yeah. Alright, let's slice through that with the hypertherm and get to it. Alright YouTube, 1.5 inch plate with a 45 amp plasma cutter isn't really recommended, but it can be done. Alright, so now that we have that severed in two, it's the reason why they call it severance cutting, and I went in the house and ate some dinner. We're going to be talking about welding thicker steel. Now, you know, you can probably infer a few things already at this point. First off, well, primarily that we're going to be putting down much larger welds. We'll be running these 5/32 inch Hobart 7018s, and you know, much like when we went from 1/8 inch to 3/32 inch, the difference between the electrodes, although it doesn't sound like a whole lot, is huge. We ran our 1/8 inch electrodes, what, at about like 120 or so amps, while these 5/32 inch electrodes we're going to be running at 170, and needless to say, since this is 7018, we will be using DC electrode positive. But you know, if you have an AC only stick welder, this is definitely something you can still be capable of doing. Alright, so now that we got that out of the way, I guess we ought to talk about the differences between welding on, you know, what most people would consider to be average thickness material for most things, and welding on something that's, you know, 1.5 inches thick. Now, the larger the electrode you're running, the higher the deposition rate, which is, as the name implies, how much material that you're depositing into your weld, and basically means you'll get more welding done faster with larger diameter electrodes. So with that being said, let's go ahead and make some progress on welding this out. I mean, I guess we might as well leave it in the flat position, at least to try it out. Is this hot? Yeah, it's warmish, if that's a word. Yeah, screw it. Let's do horizontal. I'll do horizontal in the video, and if you want to do flat before you try horizontal, that's up to you. Much like we did when we first did, you know, fillet welds. And there you have it, YouTube, 6 passes of 5 32nd inch Hobart 7018s. Now, as you can see, I did a normal 3-pass fillet weld just like we did in part 2, except with a you know, slightly larger electrode, of course. And I figured with the last 3 beads it'd be kind of cool if I could show you that the bead placement and the overlap is about the same, so I tried to stop them all short, which I did. It wasn't quite as even as I would have liked, but you still get the idea. Basically, you know, as I just said, there's the 3 passes here, and I'm maintaining the same exact bead placement and bead overlap that we used to do a 3-pass fillet weld. I just deposited passes 4, 5, and 6. And again, like I said in that video, you could carry this on pretty much indefinitely. Now, for 1.5" thick plate, that weld's probably a little bit undersized, but for the purposes of this video and for talking about working with thicker steel, I feel like it serves a good demonstrational purpose. Now, with a number of the things we've done, the different joint configurations, especially, you know, working with thinner steel, striking an arc, maintaining it, you know, with a lot of things, there has to be as much background knowledge as there does hands-on practice. And with this and some other things, I feel like it's primarily just about doing it. As my buddy Wes would say, there's nothing to it but to do it. And with welding thicker steel, you know, if you can lay a good 3-pass fillet weld on a 1/4" inch plate with 1/8" inch electrodes, really the best way to learn how to stick weld thicker materials to get some bigger electrodes and some more amperage and do the same exact thing. The fundamentals are pretty much the same. The only thing that's going to change is the thickness of the material and the size of the electrode that you're working with. So, I hope that about covers that. Yeah, this isn't... I realize that this educational welding series I'm trying to put together isn't exactly what myself or probably a lot of other people would consider to be 100% ideal. 100% ideal would be spending 40+ hours a week in a formal welding school, but if you're watching this series and you're running out to your garage and practicing stuff and coming back, rewatching the video and thinking about it, run back out again, and doing that, you know, we all know it's not 100% ideal, but there's no reason why it can't be fairly well-rounded. And in my opinion, anyone who has anything that resembles a well-rounded background in welding is going to have to know how to deal with thicker material and with thinner material. So I hope we touched on that in this video. But as always, you're just going to have to practice the daylights out of this, make it your own. You know, if you're having issues, maybe watch some of the troubleshooting videos I've done, maybe post pictures on a forum, but I just wanted to give you all a crash course in this. And you're watching the final installment of this relatively short at-home teach-yourself stick welding YouTube lesson series thing. I'm pretty sure that's its official name. If that's not what it says above this video, that's what it's supposed to say. Alright, so, you know, hopefully, now that we're into this final segment, you guys maybe took a little bit of time, watched the 7018 vertical video that I've directed y'all to in the last episode of this, and hopefully you've had a chance to try that out. But now, in continuing with our theme of going from flat to horizontal to vertical to overhead, well, we're going to do some overhead. So we're going to be working primarily with some 7018 tonight, and I'm going to be giving y'all hopefully all the information you need to go out there and make your first overhead welding experience a positive one. Now I'm going to be giving y'all 4 main tips that I've sat down and thought about and realized, you know, if I was going to teach someone how to stick weld overhead, these are the 4 biggest things I'd want to tell them. The first thing is you're going to be working against gravity. Now this is good because smoke rises and you won't be breathing in as much smoke as you normally would, but it's bad because chunks of molten metal and slag and whatnot are heavier than air and thus will be falling onto you, which is kind of a bad time. But mainly it's bad if you're not prepared for it because your weld puddle is going to sag. You know, if I got this fillet weld here in the flat position, gravity is going to be actually working with me. It's going to be keeping the puddle in the middle of the joint, and it's going to be a pretty relatively easy time by comparison. Up here, however, gravity is obviously not working with you, but luckily, there's a few things we can do to counter that. The first is to run a shorter arc, I'll say. As you've probably learned by now, running a longer arc produces more spatter. It produces a puddle that you have a little bit less control over as opposed to running a short, more focused arc. And for that reason, you're going to want to run a shorter arc. Now, how do you know when you have about the properly sized arc? Well, that's mostly up to personal preference. But you know your arc is way too long when it looks like there's globs of molten material rolling off the tip of your electrode. And you know, under the hood, they always used to remind me of airsoft pellets. If you ever played airsoft, you know those little orange BBs. They look about like that, and if you see them shooting off the tip of your electrode and going down, well, you're running way too long of an arc. There's too big of a gap between the tip of your electrode and the molten weld puddle for those globs of metal to jump, so they just fall back to earth and into your shoes and whatnot. The next way we're going to counter gravity is to change our rod angle a little bit. If I was going to be working on, that's not on camera, is it? If I was going to be working on this fillet weld here, I would probably use, you know, the rod angle that I recommended y'all to work with on various fillet welds. But if I was going to use that angle on an overhead weld, it would probably look something like this. However, I'm going to bring my rod in, kind of like that, and sort of try to shove the puddle up onto the top plate and let gravity pull it down a little bit and work it into the bottom plate. Now, if you take this too far, you'll have great tying on the top plate and like a horrendous cold toe on the bottom plate. But if you manage to get a feel for this, then, well, here, I'll put it this way. You don't aim for the middle of the weld joint like you would in the flat position. You aim for the top of it and you just let gravity sort of pull it down and onto the second plate. I hope that makes sense. I'll just try to keep it short and sweet so I don't sit here and ramble all night. Alright, so next up is the fact that heat rises. This sounds obvious. And although it's not the biggest thing for you to keep in mind, much like, you know, first one, gravity, that's probably the main lesson I'd want you all to take out of this, but heat rises, and because of that, your workpiece is going to heat up. If you're doing multiple passes in the overhead position, it might not be a bad idea to keep a bucket of water around so you can dunk your practice piece. Of course, when you're working on an actual project, the rapid cooling makes the steel a little bit more brittle in most cases, so that's probably not a good idea. But if you're just practicing in your garage or whatever, and your workpiece is starting to get all nice and hot, I recommend that you just cool it off because you got enough on your plate already. Having material that's just kind of all hot and gloppy, that's not going to make your life any easier whatsoever. Alright, now, the next tip I'm going to give y'all is to be as steady as humanly possible. Now, this is something we've talked about when welding in the other various welding positions, but it's especially true with overhead because if I'm welding this on my table here, I can lean up against the table, and because I'm working with gravity, I find it a little bit easier to be nice and steady. And as we all know, if you're not steady and you're welding like this, it's going to look like some sort of hot mess, and nobody wants that. And with overhead, this is particularly important because if you run too long of an arc because you're moving everywhere, you know, that alone will cause things to get out of hand a little bit, and then you're going to have to try a lot harder to keep control of your molten weld puddle. A couple things you can do to steady yourself: lean up against the bench like I mentioned, or in some cases you can take your lead and just wrap it around your arm. You gotta be careful with this too. If you're in some sort of job shop or factory type setting and you do this and something drives by and catches your lead, it'll pull your arm off. But you know, if If you're in a situation where you can safely wrap the lead around your arm without bad things happening to you, well, that's going to take a lot of the weight off of your hand here and help to make you more steady. When I was first learning this in high school, we had these big concrete booths that we welded in, and I positioned myself so I could lean up against the booth and just kind of pull the electrode along like such. So there's that, and one final note before we actually start laying down some metal is you're really going to want to protect yourself if you're welding overhead, especially with stick. Overhead stick welding is not something you want to take shortcuts with in terms of safety gear, because stick welding alone is kind of painful if you're not wearing the right stuff, and now everything's going to be raining directly down onto you. So don't take chances with safety gear. This is definitely one situation where I'll ditch my Canadian tuxedo style denim shirt that I usually wear and wear these heavy duty welding leathers. Now in terms of amperage, you're probably not going to be able to get away with as wide of a range overhead as you could flat or horizontal. But working with the same 1/8 inch 7018s we've used in other videos, I'm going to set this thing to about 120 amps, maybe 115 amps, and DC electrode positive, of course. Alright YouTube, so as you can see, it's evenly distributed onto both plates. We don't have any undercut or nothing horrendous. And but the one thing I would like to point out is, as you can see, this is slightly convex. I usually try to make my welds flat to slightly convex, usually more towards the flat side of things, but this is more towards the slightly convex side. And that's simply because when it's up there being welded on, you know, gravity's just pulling that puddle back down, so a little bit of that's pretty unavoidable. But overhead welding, like pretty much anything else we've talked about, and probably anything else you're going to do in your welding careers, you know, it's one of those things where it's got a little bit of a learning curve, but if you have an idea of what to do and you spend a little bit of time trying to do it, perfect it, well, you got it made. Alright YouTube, so, behold, overhead stick welding. I hope it's everything that you hoped it would be. Alright, so I think this about winds down the video. I gave you guys some tips. I did the best demonstration I could put together on how to do it, and even told you guys a few ways on how not to do it, and hopefully how to diagnose some problems that you may have with your first overhead stick welding endeavors. And tonight I'm out here in the shop going to make a nice stick welding video for y'all. And tonight we're going to make some bad welds. And all my trolls are like, oh, he finally admits it. No, that's not what this is about. I get the occasional message or comment here on YouTube, people that are like, you know, I'm trying to weld this or that. My welds aren't turning out that great. They look like this. I'm having this problem. And what am I doing wrong? And so I'm going to make some bad welds out here tonight, and we're going to talk about everything that goes on a little bit. I'm going to make a weld with too long of an arc. That's a really common problem. That's a problem I used to have when I first started welding. I'm going to use the wrong drag angle. We'll get some nice slag entrapment going on. I'll show you what that looks like. We're going to run too hot, and we're going to run too cold, and we're going to go too fast and too slow. Okay, so the first problem weld we're going to do is going to be the long arc. This is a really common problem. Like I said, this is something that I used to do when I first started welding. But basically, normally when you weld, you're going to want to hold the tip of your electrode pretty much just right down in there with your puddle. Not contacting the puddle, but probably like a hair's width above it, you know. Really, really close. It's something you get a feel for as you go. But with the long arc, I'm going to hold it back about here, and show you all what that looks like. Okay, so when you long arc a weld, the problem that you have is that because the arc is so long, it can't focus on the puddle like it does when you're welding normally, and because of that, the arc just jumps everywhere and there's metal flying everywhere, and it's a big mess, and it's characteristically a big mess, specifically with a lot of splatter. And let me show you what it looks like here. This is done at 125 amps. But basically, I didn't want to take the slag off here because I was afraid I'd take a lot of the splatter with it. But that's what it looks like. It is just a big splattery mess. You can get a lot of undercut doing that. I don't know. I guess we fared pretty well with this weld. But that's at about the right amperage. This is what happens when you run way too low. Just globs of metal that aren't focused at all. This is what it looks like when you combine running way too cold with way too long of an arc. This was with 50 amps on the machine. If you've ever set a wire welder to flux core and used the wrong polarity, this is about what it looks like. So, but yeah. Alright, next up, wrong drag angle. Let's do it. Okay, so next up is the wrong drag angle. Or, well, wrong angle, let's say. Basically, when you stick weld, you have to sort of drag the puddle with you. Imagine my virtual molten puddle of metal right there. You have to just drag it with you along the joint. And the reason for that is this brownish tan stuff around the steel electrode here is called flux, and when it's in the weld it's called slag, and what it does is it protects your forming weld from gases in the atmosphere that would destroy it. But basically what that means is you have to drag this along and let the force of the electric arc push that slag back, and when it gets pushed back it stays out of the puddle, and then you don't have the huge wormholes that I'm hoping to generate here. But basically, it's important to use a pretty substantial drag angle with 7014 because it has a very heavy layer of slag. Other electrodes like 6010, 6011, 7018 are a bit more forgiving, so you can come up a little bit. But basically, a lot of the people that, well, a number of people that have experience with MIG welding don't really understand that concept because obviously there's no slag with MIG, so they'll try to push a stick electrode and get lots of nice big holes in it. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to try to push this along. I've honestly never tried this stick welding, so I don't know how it'll go, but I'll do my best to mess this up. Let's do it. I'll be perfectly honest, YouTube, that came out a lot better than I ever thought it would. But alright, basically I did get one nice hole in it. That's what we're looking at right there. That big gap of where there's supposed to be weld metal, but it's full of really porous, nasty looking slag. That's what we're talking about. And basically, what this is caused by is when you're pushing the weld, or you're not using a steep enough drag angle, a little bit of that molten slag, which you could see in that last clip, you know, actually in front of the weld, but what's normally behind the puddle. What happens is that gets sucked down into the puddle, it gets stuck in the forming material, and then it sort of comes to the surface and just blows out the weld that's around it. And that's what happens when you get these holes. So if you're having nice wormholes, that's the politically correct term for this. If you're having these nice wormholes show up in your welds, what you should really try to do is to use a steeper drag angle. Like if you're just sort of perpendicular to the weld like this, come down some. And you'll learn to recognize the difference pretty quickly between molten weld metal and the slag that's, if you're using any real drag angle behind it. And the trick is to keep that slag at the back of the puddle. So, alright, let's see what's next. So the next problem weld we're going to do is too hot of a weld. Let's see. Basically, you'll be able to tell by the sound, whereas when you're running the right amperage, a stick weld will sound kind of like bacon frying. That's what the cliche is, and it's actually pretty true. But when you're running way too hot, it'll just be like wah, It'll be loud. It'll have a completely different sound, and that'll be your first indication. And so let's come over here and crank this up. I ran that last weld at 115 amps. Let's do this at 167. Sure, why not? Okay, yeah. Okay, so here's our too hot of a weld. Basically, first off, you can tell by the sound, like I said, and the other thing is, it just looks baked. There comes a point when after you've been welding for a little while, you can just look at a weld and be like, that's too hot, or that's too cold, or it has this problem or that problem going on. But hot weld will have a really distinctive, sort of a messy looking, weld to it. And another characteristic is there's a lot of splatter going on, again, because it's sort of a pretty violent arc that's going on there. And the other thing, when you're welding, you'll see the plate, you'll see the weld seam ahead of you just get dug out. And if you're welding a lap joint, you'll cut into the top plate. And probably the most distinctive characteristic of too hot of a weld is what's known as undercut. It's when there's a little valley between here and the plate, when it kind of just digs in. And what causes that is too much heat. You melt the metal out of there, and not enough metal. No metal ever goes back, so you're left with kind of a valley up in here, most commonly on a flat position fillet weld. And so that is too hot of a weld. Next up, the polar opposite, too cold of a weld. Now, one thing I'll say about this before we even get going is a lot of the time when people have problems getting an electrode going, it's because of their running way too cold. So if you're out there trying to weld and you're just sticking one electrode after the other and you're having to break them loose, you're getting mad, try cranking your welder up like 2 notches or something. If your welder doesn't have notches and you're lucky, I would crank it up 20 amps and see if that helps. Just some random number, and you can fine tune it from there. But one of the major, probably the biggest cause of people that have problems with electrode sticking would be that they're running too cold. So let's do that next. Notice the weak arc. Come on, don't die. And this is our cold weld. Now, because we're not running nearly the amperage that we're supposed to be running, we got the wormholes because we have a really weak arc, and like I described earlier, that slag has to be shoved to the back of the puddle by the arc, and if the arc is at half the strength it's supposed to be, that's probably not going to happen. You can have some, you can definitely have some issues like this. But overall, the main characteristics of a cold weld are going to be that it's tall, whereas with a weld that isn't cold, like that one over there, Come on, focus. As you can see, that's sort of a flat weld right there. Whereas this over here is really tall and convex, I think. I think that's the one. I get them mixed up sometimes. But as you can see, the metal is pretty much just sitting on top of the weld is pretty much just sitting on top of the metal. It's not burned in. There's very little, if any, penetration going on here. And that is not going to be a strong weld whatsoever. And that, my friends, is what a cold weld looks like. So if your welds are kind of lumpy, if they're stringy like this, and if they're just sitting on top, definitely give your welder a little bit more power there. Okay guys, so I just ran the too fast of a weld, and basically this is what it looks like here. Essentially, it's honestly not that bad, but at the same time it's really not burned in. You can tell, just for comparison, a weld that's done at about the right speed will be a little bit wider, generally 2 to 3 times the diameter of the electrode. That's what everyone says. You can see that one's kind of wide. This is really narrow and skinny looking. And if you're having welds come out like this, definitely go slow. And by slow, I mean majorly slow. Now, I remember when I first started welding, this is something that I used to do. The first time I welded up at our Adkins barn, I didn't even really deposit a weld. It was just like a long arc strike across whatever the heck that thing was. And it's a problem I had pretty much up until I started taking welding classes at my local high school. I'd show something to my teacher and he'd be like, dude, you're going way too fast, and he'd go slower, and I'd be like, I am going slow, and he'd be like, go like a third as fast as you're going now. And I did, and I remember the first time I did that under the hood, and I was like, oh, maybe with a little eye twitch thrown in there. But if you're having these problems go way slower than you're going now, you'll be surprised. You'll actually see the puddle kind of melt into the sides as opposed to just being deposited, you know, along your seam. There's a noticeable difference, and you'll definitely pick it out. So last and not least, too slow. Yeehaw. So I just welded out half of this joint going way too slow, and the problem I'm having there, as y'all can see, is because we're not moving forward, the slag's not moving back, and so we got a nice wormhole going on there. And you know what, 7018 is a lot more forgiving, so I'm just going to come over here and grab an electrode, and I'm going to show y'all what a real blob looks like, hopefully without the slag hole. Ladies and gentlemen, I introduce you to the blob. Dun dun dun. Alright, so basically, the problem with going too slow is, well, first off, that you bake the crap out of whatever it is that you're welding. And the other thing is you can actually get a cold weld by going too slow. It sounds counterintuitive, but in order to get a weld that's burned in, you have to add the right amount of heat to the right amount of filler. And if you're not moving, you're adding in filler faster than the arc can kind of wash it into the sides. So that filler's just piling up, and you're getting too tall and cold and lumpy of a weld. And structurally, I think that's the main reason why making a slow weld is not a good thing. But like I said, as you can see, it's definitely not getting spread out and burned in. It's a blob of molten material. And if you have a really fat, wide weld bead, well here, see, look at that, and look at this. This is a 3-pass 7018 weld I ran today because I felt the need to. 3 passes that are about the right size are equivalent to the blob here. And so if your welds are coming out and they're looking lumpy, and they're looking like they're not, like the weld metal isn't distributed, if it looks just piled up along your weld seam, definitely try going a little bit faster. And if you make a video about it, don't hold your pointer in one hand, because then you can't zoom your camera out when it's zoomed in too far. But anyway, yeah, there we go. So anyway, this has been my video. These are the 6 most common stick welding problems that I've seen. I've actually had a number of these myself when I first started getting going. And the other thing, if you've never stick welded before, if you've only stick welded a handful of times or whatever, there are 2 things I can predict. First off, you'll go too fast. And second, Having a brain fart here, it's late. You'll run too long of an arc. Yeah, that's it. How do I know that? Because that's what I did when I first started going. And I've had a couple friends come out here and stick weld for the first time. That's what they did. And at the high school I mentioned earlier, you had to be a junior or a senior to go there. And we had this thing called sophomore career days. And that's when prospective students would come out and they'd try their hand at welding. And I got to show probably a dozen or so sophomores how to weld, how to stick weld for the first time. And that's what they all did. They all went way too fast and used way too long of an arc. So if you're going to start stick welding, you're probably going to have one or both of those problems. So my advice is to really shove the end of the electrode down in there and just creep along and see if that helps. So anyway, I really hope you guys have enjoyed this video. It's taken me a surprisingly long time to make it. But anyway, I really hope it helps you all out. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to rate, comment, and subscribe for more.